In 2000, Netflix offered to sell itself to Blockbuster for $50 million. Blockbuster's executives reportedly laughed them out of the room. I want to be careful with this one because the popular version of this story has gotten a little bit like the tulip bulb, dramatized past what's actually documented. But the core of it is real, and it's one of the clearest examples I've ever watched of a company defending the business it had instead of building the one its customers actually wanted next. Blockbuster, at its peak, wasn't just a video rental company. In the year 2000 alone, late fees, the charge you paid for keeping a movie past its due date, brought in roughly $800 million, about 16% of the company's entire revenue. That's worth sitting with for a second. A real, measurable, 9-figure piece of the business was built on customer frustration, not customer delight. Now picture Netflix walking in 2000, with a completely different model, a flat monthly fee, movies by mail, no due dates, no late fees at all. From the outside, that's not just a competitor. That's a direct attack on the exact mechanism that was making Blockbuster's existing business profitable. Saying yes to that deal wouldn't just mean buying a small company. It would mean admitting that a real piece of their own revenue was actually a customer complaint waiting to be fixed by somebody else. This is status quo bias in its purest form, not stupidity, not a lack of information. Blockbuster's leadership had the information right in front of them. What they didn't have was a reason inside their own incentive structure to want it to be true. Defending what's already working, even when the evidence says it's about to stop working, is almost always easier than tearing it down yourself. This isn't just a phrase I'm reaching for to describe what happened. It's a real, named, measured bias in decision-making research. Economists William Samuelson and Richard Zeckhauser gave it its formal name in 1988 in a paper simply called Status Quo Bias in Decision-Making. They ran a series of decision experiments and then checked the theory against something with real stakes: how people actually chose their health insurance and retirement plans at work. Same pattern every time. People disproportionately stuck with whatever plan they already had, in numbers too large to explain by the current option simply being the best fit for everyone. Not because they'd carefully compared the alternatives and picked the current one, because changing felt like a decision, and staying felt like nothing, like the default, the safe non-choice. That's the exact same shape as a boardroom in 2000, looking at a $50 million offer and a monthly fee mailing model, and choosing to do nothing instead. What happened next is... And here's the detail that makes it worse, not better. This wasn't a failure of imagination. Blockbuster wasn't blindsided by a business model nobody could have predicted. The model walked into their office and offered to sell itself to them directly. They had the closest possible view of the threat, and the closest view didn't help because the problem was never visibility. Is the part everyone already half remembers. Netflix built its own model without Blockbuster's help. Streaming arrived and made the mail-order DVD model look quaint within a decade. Blockbuster, the company that once had thousands of stores and a business built on customers showing up in person, filed for bankruptcy protection in 2010. 10 years. That's how long it took to go from turning down the deal to running out of road entirely. And if this were just a Blockbuster problem, it'd be a strange one-off story. It isn't. The same exact shape shows up in a company that in some ways had it even worse, because they didn't just miss the future. They built it, and then buried it themselves. In 1975, an engineer at Eastman Kodak named Stephen Sasson built something that didn't exist yet, the world's first self-contained digital camera. Toaster-sized, black and white, took 23 seconds to capture a single image onto a cassette tape. He brought it to Kodak's executives and showed them the future of photography, running on their own company's payroll. Now, I want to be careful here, the same way I was careful with the Blockbuster meeting. The popular version of this story says Kodak buried the invention out of pure fear and never touched it again. That's not quite right. Kodak did patent the technology. They did keep developing digital imaging after Sasson's prototype. The real story is quieter and honestly more familiar. Digital wasn't ready for a mass market in 1975. Film was still overwhelmingly profitable, and every internal incentive pointed toward protecting that business, rather than racing to replace it with something slower, lower resolution, and less profitable per unit. Nobody made one dramatic, villainous decision to kill the future. 1,000 smaller, individually reasonable decisions to keep prioritizing the business that was already working added up to the same result. By the time digital cameras were actually good enough and cheap enough for regular people, Nikon, Canon, and Sony had built the market Kodak's own patents made possible. Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in January 2012, the company that held the original patent on the technology. Put a number on that collapse. Kodak's market value peaked at somewhere around $28 to $30 billion in the mid-1990s, with more than 140,000 people on the payroll worldwide. By the time the bankruptcy filing actually happened, the company's total value had fallen to roughly $1.2 billion. That's not a company that slowly faded. That's a company that held on to a fortune's worth of momentum and rode it almost all the way to zero. And if two companies feels like a pattern, here's a third, faster and more recent. BlackBerry controlled roughly half the U.S. smartphone market in 2007, the same year the iPhone launched. Internally, the touchscreen, all-glass interface was reportedly dismissed as a novelty. Nice for a gadget, not serious enough for a device built around the physical keyboard and enterprise security that BlackBerry's whole business identity was built on. By 2013, less than 6 years later, that roughly 50% share had fallen under 3%. Same shape as Blockbuster, same shape as Kodak. Not a company that failed to see the future, a company that had strong, specific, defensible reasons to keep building the present instead. Put Blockbuster and Kodak side by side and the pattern gets impossible to miss. Neither company was blindsided. Blockbuster had the model walk into their office and offer to sell itself to them. Kodak had the technology built on their own engineering floor, on their own budget, by their own employee. Both had the clearest possible view of what was coming, and in both cases, that clear view didn't save them, because the problem was never visibility. It was that seeing the future clearly and having a reason to act on it are two completely different things, and the second one is a lot harder to manufacture than the first, especially when acting on it means admitting your current, comfortable, profitable business has an expiration date. This isn't laziness and it isn't stupidity, the same way the herd running from a threat that isn't there isn't stupidity. It's a structural blind spot in how incentives get built. Nobody at Blockbuster or Kodak had a job description that said, protect the shrinking part of the business at the expense of the company's future. but plenty of people at both companies had a job description that said, in effect, hit this quarter's numbers using the model that's currently working, and that quieter, more reasonable-sounding incentive won every single time it came up against a bigger, scarier, harder-to-quantify future. There's actually a direct line from this episode back to the one on loss aversion. The same researcher behind that work, Daniel Kahneman, teamed up with Jack Netsch and Richard Thaler in 1991 to publish a paper connecting three biases that turn out to be close cousins. The Endowment Effect, where owning something makes you value it more than you would if you were just considering buying it. Loss aversion, which we've already covered, and status quo bias, tonight's topic. Their argument was that all three come from the same root. Once something is yours, whether it's a mug, a market position, or a business model that's currently paying the bills, giving it up registers as a loss. And we already know from 2 episodes ago exactly how much heavier a loss feels than an equivalent gain. Status quo bias isn't a separate, unrelated glitch. It's loss aversion, wearing a different hat, showing up before you've even made a decision yet. The uncomfortable lesson here isn't really about Blockbuster's specific mistake or Kodak's. It's about how many of us are sitting on our own version of that late fee revenue line right now. Some habit, some approach, some "this is just how it's done" piece of our own financial life that's quietly working against us, that we'd rather defend than examine, because examining it might mean admitting it needs to change. Here's what that actually looks like at the size of one person's finances, not a whole company's. It's the subscription you haven't used in 4 months but haven't canceled, because canceling means admitting you were wrong to sign up. It's the savings account paying you almost nothing that you've never moved, because researching a better one feels like work and the current one isn't technically losing money. It's the investment you're still holding, not because you've reevaluated it and it still makes sense, but because selling it would mean turning a paper decision into a real one. None of these are late fees. They don't show up as a labeled line on a pie chart, but they're the same instinct at a smaller scale. Keep the thing that's familiar, because changing it requires an active decision, and staying requires none. If you want an actual test, not just a feeling, pick one comfortable, familiar piece of your financial life and ask yourself the same question Blockbuster never had to answer under pressure until it was too late. If I were seeing this option for the first time today, with no history attached to it, would I still choose it? If the honest answer is no, you've found your late fee line. It was incentive. I left the herd. I never left the plains. What's the one thing in your own financial life you'd rather defend than examine? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe for the next case study.